On the night of June 2, 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat aboard the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built, moving silently through the Pacific. Around him stretched hundreds of miles of dark ocean. Ahead of him, far beyond the horizon, Japan's carrier force was already moving toward Midway. Yamamoto believed he knew where the enemy was. He believed the operation was proceeding as planned, and at that moment, he was wrong. 2 days later, his carriers would burn. Yamamoto was not reckless. He was not careless. He was the most thoughtful naval strategist Japan possessed. He understood that modern war was no longer decided by armor alone, but by information. That was why he insisted on strict radio silence. That was why he spread his fleet across enormous distances, and that was why he trusted that every critical order would arrive exactly where it was needed. Somewhere between Tokyo and the forward carriers, that trust failed. A warning existed. It was written. It was transmitted. It reached Yamamoto's command network, but it did not reach the men who would fight the battle. No explosion marked its disappearance. No enemy intercepted it. The order simply stopped moving, and because it did, an entire carrier force would enter combat blind to what awaited them. On the morning of June 4th, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the carrier Akagi, looking out over a calm sea that revealed nothing of danger. He believed the Americans were far away. He believed Midway was isolated. He believed time was on his side. Above his flight decks, aircraft were being fueled and armed under the assumption that surprise still belonged to Japan. It no longer did. When American aircraft finally appeared, they did not introduce chaos. They confirmed it. The outcome that followed did not begin in the sky over Midway. It began earlier, in silence, with an order that never reached Admiral Yamamoto. From that moment forward, Japan's greatest naval force was already living on borrowed time. In the first half of 142, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood at the center of Japan's naval war. He was not merely a fleet commander. He was the architect of Japan's carrier doctrine, the strategist who had argued against war with the United States and then designed its opening blow when war became unavoidable. Yamamoto understood American industrial power better than most of his peers. He believed Japan could only survive by forcing a decisive naval battle early, before American shipyards could turn steel into fleets faster than Japan could respond. Midway was conceived as that battle. The plan reflected Yamamoto's mind and his fears. The capture of the small atoll, located roughly 1,100 miles northwest of Hawaii, would extend Japan's defensive perimeter and, more importantly, draw out the American carriers that had escaped Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto did not intend merely to seize territory. He intended to destroy the enemy's remaining carrier force in a single, overwhelming engagement. Only then, he believed, could Japan negotiate from strength. To achieve this, Yamamoto divided his forces across immense distances. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's first carrier striking force would lead the operation, carrying 4 fleet carriers and their air groups toward Midway. Behind them, hundreds of miles to the west, Yamamoto followed with the main body aboard Yamato, accompanied by battleships, cruisers, and support vessels. Additional forces moved toward the Aleutian Islands to divert American attention northward. This dispersion was deliberate and dangerous. Yamamoto believed that concealment outweighed cohesion. Radio silence was enforced with near-religious severity. Messages were restricted, delayed, and filtered to prevent American direction finding from locating Japanese units. In theory, Yamato would serve as the nerve center, receiving intelligence from Tokyo and relaying essential orders forward at carefully chosen moments. In practice, this created a fragile chain in which information had to move flawlessly across space, hierarchy, and technology. Japanese naval intelligence in Tokyo monitored American activity closely. By late May, analysts noted unusual movements. American radio traffic suggested heightened readiness. Reconnaissance reports hinted that the enemy might not be as unaware as hoped. None of this proved decisive on its own, but together it raised an uncomfortable possibility. Surprise might be compromised. The system designed to protect Yamamoto's plan now faced a contradiction. To preserve secrecy, information had to move slowly. To preserve accuracy, it had to move quickly. The balance between those two imperatives would determine whether Nagumo entered battle informed or blind. And in the days before Midway, that balance quietly tilted towards silence. As the Japanese fleet advanced across the Pacific in the final days of May 1942, information began to pool unevenly within the command structure. Tokyo Naval Intelligence received fragments that, taken together, suggested danger. American submarines were reported farther west than expected. Long-range patrol aircraft appeared to be flying patterns inconsistent with routine defense. Radio traffic from Pearl Harbor showed signs of coordination rather than confusion. None of these indicators proved that the Midway plan was compromised, but they hinted that the enemy might be waiting rather than reacting. On June 2nd, a consolidated assessment was prepared in Tokyo. It did not declare certainty. It did not claim American carriers had been located. It warned instead of possibility. The Americans might have detected the operation. Their carriers might already be moving. The message was cautious in tone, shaped by the understanding that false alarms could be as damaging as silence. It was transmitted through established channels toward the combined fleet. The assessment reached Admiral Yamamoto, aboard Yamato without incident. His staff reviewed it carefully. The warning did not contradict his expectations, but it challenged his assumptions. If the Americans were aware of the Midway operation, then the entire premise of surprise collapsed. The success of Nagumo's carrier strike depended on the belief that no enemy carriers were within immediate striking distance. If that belief was wrong, timing became critical. Yamamoto's position, however, placed him far behind the decisive point. Nagumo's carriers operated hundreds of miles ahead, beyond visual range, beyond immediate support. Communication between them was intentionally constrained. Radio silence had preserved Japanese secrecy throughout the early months of the war. Breaking it unnecessarily risked revealing the fleet's position and inviting submarine attack. Yamamoto's staff weighed the warning against that risk. They assumed, reasonably but incorrectly, that Nagumo possessed similar intelligence. Doctrine held that essential information would propagate forward through parallel channels. There was no immediate confirmation that the message had failed to reach the carrier force. No alarms sounded. No system flagged an absence. Silence was interpreted as continuity. The warning remained aboard Yamato. As June 3rd turned into June 4th, Nagumo's carriers approached their launch point north of Midway. Aircraft were spotted on decks. Fuel and ordnance were prepared according to a plan built on surprise. The warning that might have altered posture, reconnaissance priorities, or readiness never arrived. The fleet moved forward under assumptions that were already obsolete. The moment for correction passed without notice, and the structure of the operation hardened into inevitability. Before dawn on June 4th, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood at the center of Japan's most powerful naval formation. From the bridge of Akagi, he commanded 4 fleet carriers, their escorts, and more than 200 aircraft. His orders were clear: neutralize Midway's defenses. Preserve the striking force. Prepare to destroy the American fleet when it appeared. Every decision he would make that morning rested on one assumption: the enemy carriers were not nearby. Nagumo had reason to believe this. Japanese doctrine held that American carriers would respond cautiously, advancing only after Midway was attacked and its situation clarified. Intelligence briefings before the operation reinforced this view. Reconnaissance from flying boats and submarines had reported no confirmed American carrier presence along the expected approach routes. Most importantly, Nagumo had received no warning from Yamamoto, indicating a change in assumptions. In the structure of the Imperial Navy, silence from higher command signaled continuity, not omission. At 4:30 in the morning, Nagumo launched the first strike against Midway. More than 100 aircraft rose from the carriers and turned south. Reports soon followed that the attack had inflicted damage but failed to neutralize the island completely. Midway remained operational. Under established doctrine, this demanded a second strike. Nagumo faced a familiar decision. Should he rearm his reserve aircraft for another attack on the island, or should he hold them for a possible naval engagement that doctrine insisted would come later? The choice was not impulsive. It followed training, experience, and logic as Nagumo understood it. Without evidence of nearby enemy carriers, leaving Midway capable of launching counterattacks posed the greater threat. At approximately 7:15 in the morning, he ordered the reserve aircraft to be rearmed with bombs suitable for land targets. Below decks, ordnance crews began the laborious process of exchanging torpedoes for bombs, moving fuel lines, and repositioning aircraft in crowded hangars. Moments later, incomplete reconnaissance reports began to arrive. A delayed scout from the cruiser Tone reported enemy ships to the east, but without confirmation of carriers. The information was ambiguous and late. Nagumo hesitated. Reversing the rearming process would consume time and leave the decks in chaos. Committing fully to either course required clarity he did not have. Nagumo chose continuity. He proceeded under the belief that time still belonged to him. His carriers turned into the wind to recover the returning Midway strike aircraft. Decks filled with fueled planes, hangars filled with exposed ordnance. Fighters were allocated to escort and recovery rather than broad defensive patrols. Every action was rational within the world Nagumo perceived. The flaw lay not in judgment, but in the information that shaped it. The warning that never reached him had already transformed reason into vulnerability. Shortly after 10 o'clock on the morning, the sky above Vice Admiral Nagumo's carriers changed without warning. For more than an hour, Japanese lookouts had seen nothing but scattered clouds and empty horizon. Reports from combat air patrol pilots described no concentrated enemy formations. The belief that time remained to reorganize still held. Then, almost simultaneously, American aircraft appeared where none were expected. They came not in a single wave, but from different directions, their approach masked by altitude and timing rather than concealment. Dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown broke through the clouds above the carrier formation, just as Japanese fighters were drawn low by earlier torpedo attacks. The carefully balanced defensive screen collapsed in seconds. There was no gradual realization, no opportunity to reassess. The shift from assumption to consequence was instantaneous. At approximately 10:20 in the morning, the first bombs struck Akagi. They detonated among aircraft, being refueled and rearmed, igniting fires that spread faster than crews could respond. Moments later, Kaga and Soryu were hit in rapid succession. Each carrier had been caught in the same condition. Flight decks crowded, hangars filled with exposed fuel and munitions. The very preparations intended to maintain offensive momentum became instruments of destruction. On Akagi's bridge, officers struggled to comprehend the scale of what was unfolding. There had been no signal, no warning that this moment was approaching. The American attack did not feel like an escalation. It felt like a revelation. The assumptions that had governed every decision since dawn dissolved under the weight of visible reality. The enemy carriers had not been waiting beyond the horizon. They had already been positioned, already launched, already committed. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers were burning beyond recovery. Communications faltered as smoke and explosions severed internal systems. Damage control teams fought without coordination, overwhelmed by fires fed by aviation fuel and detonating ordnance. The window for counterattack closed almost as soon as it opened. Hiryu alone remained operational, isolated and exposed. This was the moment when belief finally yielded to fact, not because new information arrived, but because the absence of earlier information could no longer be ignored. The warning that never reached Yamamoto had shaped the morning invisibly. Its absence had guided decisions, timing, and posture. Now, as bombs fell and decks burned, the cost of that silence became unmistakable. The battle had been decided before the first American aircraft appeared. The fire merely confirmed it. In the minutes following the American dive-bombing attack, the Japanese carrier force ceased to function as an organized formation. Akagi burned uncontrollably, her flight deck warped and shattered by internal explosions. Fires spread through the hangar spaces, fed by ruptured fuel lines and detonating munitions. Efforts to flood magazines failed as power systems collapsed. By late morning, Vice Admiral Nagumo abandoned his flagship and transferred his command to a nearby cruiser. Akagi remained afloat for hours, a burning silhouette against the sea, before being scuttled by her own escorts that evening. Kaga and Soryu followed the same trajectory. Kaga absorbed multiple direct hits that ignited fires from bow to stern. Her internal compartments became inaccessible as heat and smoke overwhelmed damage control parties. She sank late in the afternoon, taking most of her crew with her. Soryu, struck in rapid succession, was reduced to a blazing wreck within minutes. Attempts to save her proved futile. She capsized and sank before nightfall. Thousands of sailors and aircrew were lost in less than a day. Only Hiryu remained operational. Her survival owed less to preparedness than to chance positioning. Her commander launched a counterstrike against the American carriers, damaging Yorktown and temporarily restoring the illusion that the battle could still be contested. That illusion lasted only hours. American reconnaissance located Hiryu by late afternoon. Dive bombers attacked at approximately 5 o'clock, striking her flight deck and hangars with the same lethal precision that had destroyed her sisters. Fires spread rapidly. By the early hours of June 5th, Hiryu was abandoned and scuttled. There was no decisive final exchange, no drawn-out engagement. The destruction unfolded in fragments, each irreversible. Communications from Yamamoto's main body arrived too late to alter events. His battleships never entered the fight. The Midway invasion force was ordered to withdraw without landing a single soldier. By the time the fleet turned westward, the core of Japan's naval aviation had been annihilated. The immediate aftermath was marked not by celebration, but by silence and shock. Survivors were recovered from oil-streaked waters. Wounded men lay on steel decks under makeshift shade. Reports filtered back in incomplete and contradictory. But the essential fact was undeniable. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and the majority of its most experienced naval aviators in less than 48 hours. The scale of the loss exceeded any previous engagement in Japanese naval history, and there was no compensating victory to balance it. As reports from the shattered carrier force reached Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto aboard Yamato on the night of June 4th, understanding arrived slowly and without drama. There was no single moment of revelation. The information came in fragments. Akagi lost. Kaga lost. Soryu lost. Hiryu burning. Each message narrowed the space for denial. By midnight, Yamamoto accepted that the Kido Butai no longer existed as an effective fighting force. Only then did the full weight of the earlier silence emerge. In reviewing the sequence of events, Yamamoto learned that the intelligence assessment sent from Tokyo on June 2nd had not reached Vice Admiral Nagumo. The warning had arrived within the combined fleet network, been evaluated, and then stalled. No conscious act of sabotage or negligence caused the failure. It was the product of doctrine. Radio silence had been obeyed. Assumptions about parallel information flow had gone unchallenged. The system had functioned exactly as designed, and that design had proven inadequate. Yamamoto recognized what this meant. The defeat at Midway was not solely the result of tactical error or misfortune. It was a structural failure. Japanese command culture emphasized control, hierarchy, and protection of plans from compromise. That culture had produced brilliant successes early in the war. At Midway, it produced rigidity, Information moved upward for evaluation, but hesitated to move forward for action. By the time certainty existed, relevance had passed. Strategically, the implications were immediate and severe. Japan's carrier strength was reduced to 2 operational fleet carriers, both damaged and depleted. Pilot training programs could not replace losses at the required pace. Industrial output could not match American shipbuilding capacity. The possibility of another decisive offensive battle vanished. From this point forward, the Imperial Navy would fight a defensive war of attrition, seeking delay rather than dominance. Psychologically, the effect was deeper. Confidence in doctrine eroded. Officers who had trusted established procedures now questioned whether obedience itself had become a liability. Yamamoto ordered the Midway operation abandoned in full. Forces were recalled. The Aleutian diversion continued without strategic purpose. The initiative passed irreversibly to the United States. The silence that had once protected Japan's plans now echoed as proof of their limits. Midway did not merely destroy ships. It exposed the cost of a system that valued secrecy over adaptability and certainty over speed. From that moment, the war Japan had hoped to control began to slip beyond reach. When dawn rose over the Pacific, the sea gave little indication of what had been decided there. Wreckage drifted. Oil spread thinly across the surface. The vastness of the ocean absorbed the violence of the previous day with indifference. For those who had survived, the battle already felt distant, unreal, as if it had unfolded too quickly to fully comprehend. The Battle of Midway did not end Japan's war, but it ended Japan's control of its direction. 4 fleet carriers, the core of its offensive power, were gone. More damaging still was the loss of trained aircrews whose experience could not be replaced. From that point forward, Japanese operations would be constrained by absence rather than ambition. Every future decision would be shaped by what could no longer be risked. History would record Midway as a triumph of intelligence and timing, and it was both. But beneath the movements of aircraft and fleets lay a quieter truth. The battle turned on what was known and what was not. The American carriers struck because they possessed clarity. The Japanese carriers burned because they did not. The difference was not courage or technology, but the flow of information through human systems that struggled to adapt to the speed of modern war. Admiral Yamamoto survived the battle, but he never escaped its implications. The system he had trusted had failed at the moment it mattered most. Silence, once a shield, had become a vulnerability. Orders that moved too cautiously had lost their power to shape events. In the years that followed, Yamamoto would continue to fight with determination, but without the initiative he had sought at Midway. The order that never reached forward command did not cause the bombs to fall. It did something more subtle and more decisive. It shaped the conditions under which choices were made. By the time reality arrived in the form of American aircraft, those choices could no longer be undone. In modern war, destruction does not always begin with impact. Sometimes it begins with absence. At Midway, the fate of Japan's carriers was sealed not by what was done, but by what failed to arrive. The ocean bore witness in silence, and the course of the Pacific War turned without a single word being spoken in time.